All right. So yeah, we've seen the impeachment. I'm not going to go through the ins and outs about the witnesses and all that. I think I'm going to focus on some of the closing arguments in the Senate, mostly by Alan Dershowitz. Some of you who have been around for a while know that he's quite interesting. You know, he's not necessarily known for his constitutional law expertise. He's a criminal defense attorney. He was one of the Dream Team members of the O.J. trial and many others as well. And so it was interesting that in the Senate, he gave a criminal defense attorney's view of the Constitution. And his job was not necessarily, frankly, to give an even dissertation about the Constitution. It was to get his client off the hook. And so, but he did a very good job. I think he did a good job in terms of defending the president. And he made some credible arguments that you know, a lot of the senators could hide behind and say, yeah, I voted with the Constitution. So his arguments, the arguments against him are somewhat subtle. So I'll talk about those arguments. So anyway, if you want to have if you have any questions about more of the background of the impeachment process or the Constitution, I could do that. But I'm going to really try to focus a lot on these final arguments. So one of the big questions is commission of a crime necessary in order to impeach somebody? That was a big one. Another one is abuse of power legitimate grounds for impeachment? And amazingly, he argued quite forcefully that no, it's not in the words of the Constitution, so it can't be. There's a little bit of a ring in here, huh? Is that?
It's still too hot. Okay.
Yeah, it's a bit of an echo. Then, what are high crimes and misdemeanors? And does executive privilege blunt congressional authority? This was maybe less focused on. Right? It's the idea that the president can say, I'm not going to cooperate at all, not going to produce any evidence. Is that impeachable? Certainly the House thought it was impeachable. And then finally, is it legitimate to impeach or refuse to impeach a president for political reasons? And let me give you a little warning here. You know, a lot of times people will ask me, because I'm a lawyer, well, what's the law say? You know, and there's a perception, and I suppose it should be true, that whatever the law says is going to be clear, you know, and it's almost black and white, right? Well, that's the law. And there are certain laws like that. Even in the Constitution, you have, you know, rules about who can become a president, right? How old you have to be. But a lot of laws are just not that clear, and there are also conflicting laws, you know. And with the Constitution, which is what we're talking about impeachment based on what the Constitution says. The Constitution is not a rule book, you know. It's not a list of regulations. It is really more an articulation of principles, and they use very few words like high crimes and misdemeanors. So don't get frustrated when I give on the one hand, and on the other hand, you say, well, what's the answer, Leland? You know, you basically say, well, who's got the better lawyer, or what are the politics of the day? So you have to accept that a little bit, okay? So with that, let's answer these questions. So what does the Constitution say about impeachment? This one is the clearest because it's right in the Constitution. It says the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the U.S. shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. Those are the words. And that's what we're arguing about. So, Dershowitz and many others have said, hey, you know, when they framed the Constitution, when they debated it, you know, there was a question, okay, what should be the grounds for impeachment? Well, first of all, let me just back up a little bit. Just the fact that we have this idea of impeachment is significant, right? Because we have elections, right? If somebody turns out to be a bozo after an election, well, you know, you just have to deal with them for 4 years, and then you kick the person out. That's perfectly plausible. But no, they wanted to have this idea of an impeachment, so that in between elections, that you can do something if something really bad happens. And so the idea then, I'll ask a question rather than state it, is, well, we're 9 months away from an election. Is it legitimate to even have an impeachment process when we're going to have an election anyway, right? Doesn't that take away the sanctity of 60 million votes, American votes? It sounds great. It sounds something to be indignant over. And say, yeah, you're trying to steal an election. You're trying to overturn the will of so many people. So I raise it as a question as opposed to an answer. Because I'm going to talk about at the very end, are political considerations legitimate? So at that time, at the time in which the Constitution was being framed, there was a question as to whether, well, let's have impeachment based on maladministration. But James Madison, who is the main author of the Constitution, had this to say. Allowing impeachment on grounds of maladministration is to create a presidency that serves at the pleasure of Congress. Because whatever maladministration means, it sounds like it means something like incompetence, making the wrong decisions, you're sloppy, maybe you disagree with the policy and so forth. And it seems that, yeah, we want some balance of interest and power sharing among the three branches. But do you really, really want Congress to be able to say, I don't agree with this, administration, or I don't agree with this pick of an officer, or I don't agree. I think that they're just being incompetent. Let's impeach them. So I think Madison had the idea that impeachment, the bar has to be a little higher. So that's one argument in favor of Dershowitz, who says the impeachment bar has to be pretty high. It can't just be at the whim of Congress or the House. Which brings to mind a statement, it was mentioned many times in the process, that Gerald Ford, Senator Gerald Ford, when he before he was president, said somewhat, because he was a Republican, and was talking about the impeachment of Nixon, basically said that, well, impeachment is basically whatever the majority of the House says it is, right? And so Dershowitz definitely had something to say against that. And yeah, that doesn't sound quite right. We'll talk about why it doesn't sound quite right. So here's an example of why, why perhaps having some kind of a crime is necessary. We have an example of Andrew Johnson. And for now, I'll just mention two of the articles against Andrew Johnson were based on his scandalous speeches given in the South during Reconstruction, in which he openly opposed the idea of Reconstruction. This is, of course, after Lincoln's assassination. And he vilified Congress. And Congress was so upset about that they included this as part of the articles of impeachment against Andrew Johnson. And so a lawyer that Dershowitz mentioned many times, his name was Curtis, who was a libertarian, kind of lefty, but who defended Andrew Johnson, basically saying, hey, look, Andrew Johnson had no reason to believe that making a speech or speeches against Congress should be illegal, should be something that he can be impeached over, right? So he hammered home the idea back then, which was basically right in that context, that you can't impeach somebody for grounds that they don't have any reasons to know that it is illegal, right? And that idea, of course, is very consistent with our American tradition, is that you can't be criminally punished unless there's a law that you broke, right? It's just a fundamental law of due process. So, for example, we have rules against ex post facto laws, right? Ex post facto, after the fact. So basically, let's say the city of San Francisco is considering and then ultimately passes a law, ordinance, that says something like, you can't say bad things about Chinese people. Okay. Okay, and it passes January 1 of 2021. Well, you can't use that law to prosecute somebody today and say, oh, yeah, a year ago you did this, and it's illegal. You can't say that. But when I did it, or when somebody was doing that, it wasn't illegal, right? So you can't do that. So in the same way, well, how can you impeach a president for doing something that wasn't a crime? There's no lack of due process there. That's Dershowitz's argument. Bill of attainder, same idea. You can't have a bill of attainder, which is something like a law that says, herewith, Uber cannot do this. That's a bill of attainder, right? That's a bill that directly targets an individual or a company. Right? You can say these kinds of actions are illegal, but you can't say, Mr. John Smith has done this, something illegal, and it's basically prosecuting somebody, without due process. So, okay. Now, there are many arguments against this idea as to why Dershowitz is wrong. First of all, he's in the minority by far. He admits it too. He says it many times. He is in the minority in terms of this idea that you need a crime in order to impeach somebody. So here's a Congressional Research Service report that's concluded over our entire constitutional history. Fewer than a third of the impeachments approved by the House have specifically invoked a criminal statute or used the term crime. Now you say, what are you talking about? How many impeachments have we had? We've had about 17. The non-presidential ones mostly dealt with judges, right? Judges who have misbehaved, including one who was perpetually drunk on the bench. There was one senator as well. So, okay, history proves that wrong. And Hamilton has been quoted, he wrote the Federalist Papers number 65. He talked about impeachment being something that is a political offense. It's a political offense is done against the state. Right? So the subjects of an impeachment trial's jurisdiction are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. They are of a nature which may, with peculiar propriety, be denominated political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself. So you imagine, okay, so this is the nature of a, let's call it a political crime. But in what world, in what universe would Congress set down in statute all the possible political crimes there are, right? There are problems with that. For one thing, as far as focusing on the necessity of some kind of a crime, well, commission of a crime may have no significance for impeachment at all, right? So if the president, for example, in some dealing with a partner, a business partner, was deemed to have defrauded that partner, and maybe he was even criminally liable, well, does that really have anything to do with impeachment or whether that person should stay in the office or not? I would say, one of the most private things that you can do as a person is, to have sex with somebody. So is lying about sex something that is impeachable? It's a violation of a crime, right? But does that rise to the level of, abuse of office and, derogation of the presidency and things like that? And on the other hand, you can think of easily many non-criminal acts, right, that are worthy of impeachment that can only be committed by somebody like a president. So the idea of just focusing on, yes, you have to have a commission of a crime, doesn't really make a lot of sense. And there are a lot of problems with even the idea that Congress, again, should somehow write a set of rules as to if the president does this, and this, then, or any of them, then that'll be impeachable, right? I mean, just think of the Ukraine situation, for example, right? Can you imagine a law that says if, when the president is carrying out his duties to, for example, transfer funds that have been approved by Congress, these are the things you can't do. You can't put, half of it in your own bank account. You can't place some conditions on it based on, to support your own political favors. I mean, one problem with that is that, there's separation of powers, right? So there's something wrong with the idea that somehow Congress has to micromanage the ways, all the different ways in which the president faithfully carries out the laws. So it's a problem with that. And we saw that in history, actually. There was Andrew Johnson again. The main charges against Andrew Johnson was the violation of a law called the Tenure of Office Act. Now, let me talk a little bit about the Tenure of Office Act. Remember, this is Reconstruction. This is post-assassination of Lincoln. And Andrew Johnson was not going with the program. He was from Kentucky. He was Tennessee. Thank you. One of those. And he was a Democrat. But he was picked because it was politically expedient, to have a Democrat on the ticket. But he really didn't believe in all this that Lincoln was talking about. And he just, he wanted to fire much of the cabinet that Lincoln picked, including the Secretary of War, Stanton. And Congress wanted to draw the line. It said, they passed this law that says that if any officer in the administration was approved constitutionally by the advice and consent of the Senate, then the president cannot terminate that person unless Congress approves. Okay, so that's going a bit too far, right? Yes, there's advice and consent for certain officers, but there's no advice and consent to terminate them, right? The idea is that the administration, the presidency, has to have some kind of leeway. And the Tenure of Office Act further said that if the president should ever violate the Tenure of Office Act, that is impeachable. So that's how President Johnson was impeached. Now, he ultimately wasn't impeached because the Senate, it didn't quite reach the 66, percent or supermajority. There was by one, and rumor has it, I think it's pretty substantiated, that one person was bribed to change the vote. So anyway, the idea is that there's really a problem with the idea that even stipulating some laws that the president has to break, and who passes laws? Congress, right? So there's a lot of problems with that. But then let's look at some of the things that have been just in history. What are high crimes and misdemeanors? This is one of these terms of art that it's really best not to try to delve into it too much, because it's been used for hundreds of years, including back in England. And some of the things that have been high crimes and misdemeanors in England were misapplication of funds. Okay, makes sense. Abuse of official power, which Dershowitz doesn't like. Neglect of duty, that sounds like maladministration. Encroachment on or contempt of Parliament's prerogatives. What are some of the things that were also, but are really, really highly questionable? Giving bad counsel to the king, that was impeachable. Advising a prejudicial peace. Now that sounds like a policy decision, right? That sounds like something that the president ought to have some kind of ability to say, this is my policy, war and peace. Except for funding, of course. Funding has to come from Congress. Purchasing offices, think, Ambassador Sondland. Preventing other persons from giving advice or counsel to the king, except in their presence, things like that. So I'm setting these examples out more in a way of saying how useless it is to try to figure out what crimes and misdemeanors really means. So what are we left with? What do we mean by crimes and misdemeanors? For example, James Madison, there was a question raised in the debate. And the question was whether in connection with Senate ratification of a treaty, for example, the president might be selective of the senators he consulted for advice and consent. Were the president to commit anything so atrocious as to summon only a few states, i.e. senators, he would be impeached for a misdemeanor. That was James Madison's view. So again, all this is to say it's pretty cloudy, right? So if you're committed to the idea that you have to go to the original intent or look at the historical records to find out what crimes and misdemeanors really means, frankly, it's going to be muddy. But secondly, it's going to give you a treasure trove of information to support whatever you want. And basically that's what happened with, I think, with Dershowitz, right? So, that still leaves us with the question, so what is impeachable, okay? Is abuse of power impeachable? Alan Dershowitz definitely says no. Why? Because abuse of power doesn't appear in the term high crimes and misdemeanors, right? So is that a good argument? And that can't be a good argument. The reason that can't be a good argument is because abuse of power itself can mean so many different things, right? And he pointed out to you a lot of things that happened in the past which once a president did something and everybody else accused or opponents accused them of abusing their power, and yet there was not an impeachment. So here's some examples. He says, look at all these times in which presidents have been accused of abusing their power. Thomas Jefferson purchasing Louisiana Purchase. No authorization. He just did it. President Nixon's secret bombing of Cambodia. Certainly was considered, but in the end, there were too many senators who actually knew about that and didn't say anything, and that would be very embarrassing. Nixon filing false tax returns. Turned out he owed $500,000 in taxes later on. That was considered when they impeached him, but they decided to leave that one out. Iran-Contra affair. President FDR's illicit arms sales to England. That's pretty big. The country was very, very pacifistic at that time, right? But Roosevelt, wanted to help an ally. Eisenhower's lies to the public about the U-2 incident. President Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon. Well, that's interesting, President Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon. Now, the president's power to pardon is as close to a monarchical power that you have in the Constitution. There's no consent required by the Senate. There's no limitation as to who to pardon. And yet, I'll get back to that in a moment. President Kennedy's affairs, Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, right? So Dershowitz's idea here is that, look, there are many, many times in our history, many times in our government in which the House or the Senate may disagree with whoever's sitting in the White House. Obama was accused many times of abusing his power when he used executive orders to enact things that he couldn't get through Congress, like DACA, right, and other things. And that was deemed to be basically violating, separation of powers and all that. But Dershowitz says, look, if we allow this nebulous and he would say phony basis called abuse of power, then it can be done anytime. And it's true. I mean, it's true, yeah. I mean, anytime you have a majority that thinks that the president abuses power, then yeah, you can actually do it. But it can't be the answer that abuse of power cannot be ever, a grounds, right? So here's something that during President Nixon's time, the House Judiciary Committee on Impeachment, this is just one authority, it's not the law, right? But it says that in American constitutional history, there have been 3 categories of misconduct held to be impeachable. And the very first thing they said is abuse of power. And if you think about it, I mean, what else would it be, really, What else would it be, right? The president has these really, really great powers, and you're supposed to use it in defense of the nation, in defense of the Constitution. And if you use it for any other means, especially for, well, bribery, for example, that's a very easy one. That's right in the Constitution, right? Or for some other means other than the best interest of the country. Now, there's a lot of gray area there, of course. That's why we have all these conflicts. But if, at some point, it's going to be abuse of power. And some would say that, what he did with the Ukraine situation was textbook abuse of power. Anyway, anyway, the line that Dershowitz tried to draw is a lot fuzzier than he portrayed it. Another issue was the obstruction of Congress, and basically the idea that the president just totally dissed Congress, right? Didn't produce a single document, request, demanded that none of his administration personnel testify. Many did. So is that impeachable? And it's kind of fuzzy here. The United States versus Nixon, there was one case that talked about executive privilege that went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, first of all, said that, yes, there is such a thing as executive privilege, right? It's similar to, it's kind of based on the idea that separation of powers, that you have to have some kind of ability to have leeway to do your job. The president does, Congress does, the courts does. But it also said this about the scope of the privilege, right? And it's helpful to think about the legal privilege, the lawyer's privilege, right? Attorney-client privilege, right? It's not as if any time you talk to a lawyer, anything you say is not going to be discoverable. It's only in the context of offering legal advice. So anyway, what the court said about Nixon's assertion of privilege, which was very broad, said, oh, about those White House tapes, when the ground for asserting privilege as to subpoenaed materials sought for use in a criminal trial is based only on the generalized interest of confidentiality. In other words, oh yeah, I'm the president, you know, I don't have to do this because it's confidential. It cannot prevail, it meaning this assertion cannot prevail over the fundamental demands of due process of law in the fair administration of criminal justice. So in that specific instance in which there was an impeachment going on, there was evidence of possible criminal behavior, impeachable behavior, the president can't just say, well, I'm the president. You know, the president has to say, this, for example, affects national security, or this is top secret, because it involves some kind of international law or with relations. No. We're talking about, you know, him basically breaking into the Watergate Hotel, and that is not within the scope of executive privilege. So that's the way I think I tend to look at it. You know, this generalized assertion by President Trump that, oh, I'm the president, I don't have to cooperate, is just way too broad. And it would just destroy any ability for Congress to do its own job. So final question is impeachment political? And this is a tough one because, you know, we usually don't think of a prosecution, a court, for example, of being political. It's the opposite, right? Neutrality is the word. Whatever the law says, whatever the jury says, the fact finder says, that should apply. But impeachment is something very, very different. And so, for example, let's compare this idea of politics in other areas that we normally wouldn't think should be political, but in fact they are. So, prosecutorial discretion. When we have a DA, for example, and the DA says, you know, I'm elected, I'm the law enforcement official, I'm not going to say that this law is not important or you can violate this law, I don't care. You can't do that, right? You're a law enforcement official, but you only have so many resources. So it's very legitimate, actually, whether you like it or not, that the DA can say, we're not going to prosecute these, you know, so-called lifestyle crimes, you know, breaking into cars and these little things that only hit property, or we're not going to prosecute prostitution. You know, yeah, it's still illegal, but I'm not going to do that. We're going to give a lot more leeway to criminals, or, you know, we're going to focus on white-collar crime. That's really our focus, right? Now, if that DA is doing that because his or her constituencies are, in fact, let's say the white-collar crime situation, right? Her constituencies really, really want to get at the big corporations, and you want to do that because you want to focus on prosecuting white-collar crimes because you want to get re-elected. Is that legitimate? I mean, how can you say it's not legitimate? So yes, there is politics in that scenario. How about legislation? How about when you vote for, you know, a House member, think of your own congressperson. Is it legitimate for that member of Congress to vote on bills based on, one, what her constituents want? That's absolutely political, isn't it? You know, you want her to vote on climate change legislation because they know that I as a voter, climate change legislation. So that person is going to vote what her base wants, right? About her personal values. Would we expect them not to follow their personal values? Now, may conflict with the constituents. Or her party's values. That one may be a little bit, arguable, right? But still, you wouldn't say that, oh, because the politician is voting because the party wants to vote that way, that would be illegitimate. Okay, but impeachment has to be something different, right? It's got to be different. I mean, impeachment is like a trial, right? And trials are not supposed to be political. This is not going to work because I don't see the whole slide. Let's see, I'm going to do this. That's right. So some people ask then, well, is impeachment a criminal matter? Is it, do we follow the criminal procedure? Or is it a civil matter, right? And the answer is, it's really its own thing. It's really its own thing. It's really neither completely civil nor criminal. So the question then, when we come to impeachment, is it okay for a senator to decide to impeach or not to impeach the president based on what the senator's base wants, right? Forget the facts. Just, does the base want me to impeach the president? Should we, some other considerations, I just asked as a question, I don't want to pretend to answer it, whether there are remedies short of impeachment that would be better, like maybe the president will resign, right? So maybe I won't impeach. That was considered in the Johnson impeachment. Is the term ending soon anyway? Would it put the country into too much turmoil if we impeach? Who would be the successor? That's an interesting consideration, right? For example, in the Johnson impeachment, I don't remember the person, but there was the next in line would be somebody that the radical Republicans definitely did not want, even though they hated Johnson, right? So that has political ramifications. So I just lay these as questions and ask you, whether you think that impeachment really is something ought to be so political as it is. When the framers said that the trial would be done at the Senate, they had very, very many reasons for doing that. They had considered doing it at the Supreme Court. They also considered having some kind of representative ad hoc body from states to come up and have an impeachment, forum. But they decided to have it at the Senate because it was, first of all, it was numerous and other reasons. But by picking, and this is not a perfect solution, right? You got to find some procedure. They knew that each one of the senators was a political person, right? Each one of the senators had political influences and things that he or she had to abide by. So you can't say that it has to be purely apolitical. Now, I'll end it with Mitt Romney, who, like him or not, he believed he was acting in a non-political way. That he thought that, hey, I had an oath that says I should do impartial justice before God, and when he saw the facts, and he couldn't, in good conscience, regardless of the political consequences, voted against the president for impeachment. So that's pretty rare. So anyway, I'll leave that, and I'll be glad to open it for discussion and comment. I know that a lot of people have a lot of ideas, so whether you have just a comment or a question is fine, doesn't matter.
Okay, so remember, I'll try to get to people in the order they put their hands up. Please hold the mic very close to your mouth, very, very close.
The current New Yorker magazine has a very good article on assassination. And also, I understand the Iranians offered $3 million to assassinate Trump. But the really dangerous thing is that Trump has 69 million followers. Like Adolf had all these Germans following him, goose-stepping, and I think if Trump is elected again, we're in deep doo-doo. So how about you collecting that $3 million from the Iranians? You could retire in Iran. $3 million. The hell with impeachment.
I kind of like my current address, so.
You don't want to take out, you don't want to make $3 million?
I was never clear on, could Trump have been, could the Senate have said he is guilty of these crimes but not removed him from office?
Sure.
If they'd have to declare that they were
The Senate
crimes.
can do it.
It's a separate step to remove him from office then.
Yeah, no, so the Senate ultimately has to either acquit or impeach. So if
I
you're
see.
saying, could a majority of the senators have enacted some kind of resolution that says, we think he did in fact violate the law? Sure, they can do that. But ultimately the question is whether they will impeach or not, and that requires a supermajority.
I see. So it's a different number to impeach than to,
You need 2/3, yeah.
yeah, okay.
You went through many. Oh, okay. You went through many cases in which abuse of power could be considered as a reason for impeachment. In this particular case, the president was using his power to interfere in the electoral process.
Right.
And interfering in the electoral process through abusing of his power,
Yeah.
in a way, is against the Constitution, I believe.
Yeah.
So there was a very well-defined accusation. Is asking a foreign country to interfere in American election.
Right, right.
So what do you think of that?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. This raises one of the more controversial things that Alan Dershowitz said, and he probably was misquoted, but he basically said that, hey, if the president has a motive in exercising his authority, carrying out his authority as a president, if some, even all, of his motivations was for political purposes, that is not impeachable. Now, again, it's too broad, but in concept, let's think about this, right? It's interesting. It's interesting to think about this. So, whatever the president does, let's say Obama, all right? Obama maybe is somebody that you perhaps would agree with. If Obama, let's say you do, or whatever, here's an example. If Obama instituted some policy because mentally his motivation really was he wanted to strengthen his base. Let's say his re-election was coming up, and he really, really wanted to, you know, to strengthen his base. So he says, let's write a rule about DACA, okay? Now, what percentage of his motivation was, I really believe in this idea of DACA. I believe that it's consistent with, you know, our American traditions. I believe that it's not contradicting any laws. But then another portion of his brain says, you know, if I did this, man, I'm going to get reelected and I'm smooth sailing. Okay. So the question is, one question is that illegitimate? Is that doing something for political purposes? Another question is, how do we ever find out? I mean, and so Dershowitz was kind of hammering on this because he's a criminal defense attorney, right? And he's always talking about mens rea, which is a Latin term meaning you have to have an evil intent in order to violate certain laws like fraud and, you know, and with first degree murder you have to have a malice of forethought in order to be committed of murder. So what Alan Dershowitz is saying that, hey, look, you know, are we going to psychoanalyze every senator and official for why they voted? You know, was it for political purposes? So that cannot be. So that general, what he says generally is true. But again, just as with the abuse of power discussion that I talked, it can't be that doing anything for political purposes is okay, right? You can't take the money in Iran and say, well, Ukraine, and if you deposit, you know, this many into all of the coffers of the Republican senators that I like, then we'll release the money. That's for political purposes, right? But somehow that doesn't seem to be legitimate. So again, Alan Dershowitz, his purpose is not to be nuanced. His purpose is to be a criminal defense attorney, give a very one-sided argument. So yeah, you can definitely cross the line. It's easiest to know if it were in fact bribery. The House, for some reason, decided not to do bribery, but I do have a slide. I didn't focus on it, but there is a congressional bribery statute that looks to me like he violated. Let me just read the statute. Here it is. Whoever, being a public official, corruptly demands anything of value personally or for any other person or entity in return for being influenced in the performance of any official act is guilty of bribery. Now, you don't have to be successful, right? If you try to bribe a cop and the cop didn't take it, you say, oh, no bribery, he didn't take it. I'm good, right? So I would say that, if the facts were true, and it seems that the facts are true, that he could have been guilty of violating an actual statute of bribery, which happens to be mentioned in the impeachment provision, which he'll be, Now, why didn't they? You can ask the question, why didn't they do it? Well, it has to do with even more levels of proof and evidence and so forth and whatever. But anyway, long-winded answer to your question. Very good question. Yes.
Like all good talks, you've raised more questions than you've answered.
That's true.
I noticed that nepotism is not listed among the crimes, and it brings to mind the famous nepotism case when John Kennedy was elected president. One of the first things he did was appoint his brother as Attorney General.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget in his first press conference when he was challenged about that, how do you justify appointing your brother as Attorney General? He famously replied, I think something like this: the family decided that young Bobby needed legal experience before going into private practice.
Tell it like it is. Thank you for that. That's fun.
Hi, I'm Ray Sunby. Thanks for your talk.
You're welcome.
I have a simple question which could have a yes or no answer, but I'd like to expound on the question after I ask it a little bit to get your thoughts on it. The question is the president above the law? And if he is not above the law, could that be a separate avenue for removing him from office? If he went out and shot somebody in public and was seen by many people or recorded on TV or whatever, and could he be charged, tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison, and would that effectively remove him from office? Or could he claim that, well, I'm in prison, but you haven't removed me from office through the impeachment Senate trial process? Could he continue on as president?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually.
And one other thing, is there a practical way to do this? He would have to be charged by the Attorney General, maybe, and the Attorney General serves at his whim, and he could say, you're fired, when he was charged, and then keep doing that.
So, is the president above the law? And the general answer is no. That's a very different question from, must the president be impeached because the president violated the law, right? So my earlier example, the president in some business transaction with a business partner was found to have violated the law by defrauding the business partner, okay? Certainly that person the president is liable to perhaps being prosecuted. Depends on the prosecutor, they may or may not. If it were the Department of Justice, they have a little internal memo that says, well, as a policy, we won't indict a president while the president is in office. That's just a policy of that particular office. It's not a policy of every DOJ or, the state of Massachusetts or whatever, New York City, right? New York. So, but that's a very different question from whether, because of the breaking of that law, that's impeachable. It's a very different question, right? And it should be, right? We don't want every single thing that a president does wrong could be impeachable. It's, like it or not, a very political process. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
No.
Okay.
It doesn't, because, so
Okay.
I'm going to say that doesn't answer the question, because I'm not talking about impeachment, and I'm sorry, this is kind of off the topic of your talk, really. But if he is charged with a crime and is convicted outside of being impeached in the House of Representatives,
Right.
then if he's convicted and sentenced to prison,
Okay.
does that effectively remove him from office? And I'm not talking about going through the process of impeachment through the House and Senate, impeachment, trial, removal from office. I'm
Yeah.
talking about
Okay.
charged with a crime, convicted, and sentenced to prison.
Okay. So let's say the president isn't. Okay. So the question is: is it possible for the president to be convicted of some crime, and during the term of his office is thrown into prison, and then he's still not impeached, right? Because we haven't gone through that process. Of course, the answer is yes. The answer is yes, yeah. Because there's no impeachment. If there's no impeachment or exercise of the Article 25th Amendment, talks about capacity, mental capacity, then there's no grounds for removing him from office. So if we want to remove him from office, then you have to go through the impeachment process, or Article 25, but it's more like impeachment.
So he would have to carry out his duties as president from prison.
If the warden lets him, yeah.
I suspect people he said, so it's picked up.
Oh, yeah.
Has anyone ever been impeached, and if so, when and who, and why?
So no president has been successfully impeached. All have been acquitted. But there's a total of about 17 impeachments in our history that included mostly judges. And yes, several of them have been impeached. Four have been impeached, I believe, and 7 have not been, and others didn't really make it through the system.
Well, I'm a little confused because the way they seem to have been talking about impeachment, that's something that happens in the House. They're forever impeached. This is on. Then the Senate gets to decide whether or not they can remove him from office, but he's still been impeached.
Okay, yes, that's true. Yeah, so it's a semantic problem here. It's a good question. So if you think of a parallel criminal process, right, there's an indictment by the grand jury, right, usually under the supervision of DA or DOJ or something like that, some law enforcement agency. And then once the indictment happens, there's no punishment or there's no, ruling until you have a trial. So essentially, what we have in impeachment is an indictment, we call it impeachment, and then we have the trial in the Senate. And you have to lose the trial by 2/3 in order to be impeached. And that 2/3 is turning out to be a pretty big, hurdle.
Terminology, in order to be impeached,
Hey,
you mean convicted.
Ray?
I'm sorry,
Asking questions.
it's come up a couple times.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me answer that. I'll ask a question and then answer. So yeah. So I repeat. So to be impeached successfully means that you have to be impeached, indicted by the House, and then successfully tried in the Senate and removed. That's a full impeachment. So when Nancy Pelosi says, it's true. I mean, it's true in the history books. He would be the 4th president to have been impeached by the House, but no president has been actually removed through the impeachment process.
So they're two separate operations.
Yeah, two-step. It's a two-step process. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, first a comment. One of the practical lessons of this event is that if 34 members of the Senate are corrupt and subservient to the president, he cannot be convicted and removed from office.
Okay.
The question I have is, you talked a lot about what Dershowitz was presenting.
Yeah.
And I'm more interested in what the prosecution and defense lawyers presented, especially since very few people think Dershowitz had any grounds for his positions. So,
Well, yeah, so that does raise an interesting question. We saw those three or four constitutional lawyers in the House. There was one day in which it was all dedicated to these legal, experts. And so, but yeah, that wasn't replicated in the Senate, actually, it's true. It only had the House managers present arguments. So yeah, there was a bit of a, I would have liked to have had somebody respond to Dershowitz, the next day. That would have been nice. It would be interesting. But it didn't happen. Yeah, I would have loved to listen to it too. Well, so, no, but, so what's the follow-up? I'll repeat it.
okay, my follow-up is that the House managers presented in depth a very strong case, and the defense presented an abbreviated and very illogical defense. And I think it would have been good to have more of the both of the other lawyers' positions presented.
I agree. Did you want a response from that? Oh, my talk. Oh, okay. Yeah. It's not enough time. Anyway, yes, it's just a comment. I don't think we need to repeat that. You're next.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I think you've made it abundantly clear that obviously Congress is making the laws, and the executives are supposed to follow the law. So it seems reasonable that if Congress thinks that the president isn't, that it's pretty much up to their opinion. If they all agree he's not following what they want him to do, then they've got a process to do it. Now, you brought up the bribery, and that's where somebody is enriching themselves at the expense of the public, and I think we all see why that's illegal. But there's definitely the emoluments clause, and why is it that they didn't follow? Because that's the same thing. It's at least the appearance of bribery, and the kind of why don't they bring that up as a possible impeachment offense?
Yeah, a lot of people would have liked that because it seems so obvious. And it's not just the Mar-a-Lago, it's really many other instances. And so, I don't think I have any insights as to why they didn't do it. I think they would try to make it so that it's not too complex. The more you throw at it, the more you're open to the accusation that you're just looking for anything that you can. It's just appearances. I couldn't tell you from a strategic standpoint. Yeah.
Jerry Grass. This conversation reminded me of an interesting historical event, which is a special investigator, prosecutor, whatever, Archibald Cox, was pursuing Nixon, and Nixon tried to fire him. So he went to the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, and said, fire him, and Elliot Richardson resigned. And then he went to the next in line, Ruckel's house, and he refused. And then he went to the next in line, and that guy fired Cox. Now that, to me, Nixon, that was a clear case of Nixon doing obstruction of justice. But he didn't get in trouble legally from it, but it turned American opinion against him, for what it's worth.
I do believe that one of the counts against Nixon being obstruction of justice included that kind of behavior. He also directed the CIA to stop the FBI's investigation and try to coerce witnesses and things like that. So it was all a bundle. Yeah.
Hi. I used to live in Geneva, Switzerland, and there were a lot of diplomats there, and they were always doing stuff, but they couldn't prosecute them because they had diplomatic immunity. And I read a mystery by Nero Wolfe in which a president of a South American country bashed and killed somebody, in an American political figure, and they were not able to prosecute him. So what I'm wondering about is, does the president have a certain kind of diplomatic immunity at all? If these minor diplomats all over the world can do whatever they want and not get prosecuted, what about the president of the United States?
Well, if the president begins to act like a mafia don and coerces witnesses, threatens them, threatens the jury members, i.e. senators and all that, that's the equivalent of diplomatic immunity, in effect. No, but no, there's no diplomatic immunity for a president.
Official.
Oh, you mean if he goes elsewhere? Oh, I see. Oh, that's never come up. That's a good question. Interesting. In other words, if let's say the president went overseas, violated some overseas law, would the president be prosecuted? Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes, but I'm also saying if he's in the United States and breaks the law, is he still covered by diplomatic?
Well, he's certainly not a diplomat at that point.
Repeat what you said. Sorry.
Yeah. So the question is, no. What if he's in the United States? Does he have diplomatic immunity? And I think the analogy breaks down because he's not a diplomat in his own country. Yeah. Yes. Hi.
Hi. You mentioned about, it's a good talk, you mentioned is impeachment political with a question mark. So based on that, assuming that impeachment is political, then why the House went to impeach Trump, knowingly that Senate may not approve it, and also it may increase the popularity of Trump, and which proved to be the case. So can you comment why House had decided to impeach Trump from political point of view?
Well, in other words, you're saying that it seemed like it was politically inexpedient for the House to do this, knowing that it was not going to succeed, and that the president was going to crow about being exonerated and completely guilty, and this whole thing's a sham, right? So why did the House do it? So again, I don't think I have any insights on that, but the House, I have heard this articulated before, and I personally agree with it. And the idea is that, look, when the president did something that appeared to be such a constitutional crime, and we didn't do it, and we have the tool under the Constitution to do it, i.e. start the impeachment process, and we didn't do it because we were afraid that it would give a political advantage to the president. That is a form of acting for political reasons as opposed to principled reasons. In the same way that maybe the Republicans, I think you mentioned, refuse to impeach the president because of political interests, right? So in some ways, that's the same argument. So should we tell the Democrats, this is politically stupid, don't do it, or in the best of worlds, if you it's not true for everybody, but shouldn't the Democrats have done this because it was the right thing to do?
Okay. Any comment about Romney and the rest of the senators? That doesn't even seem legal what they did, letting him off the hook.
Well,
what's your feeling about Romney and the other senators?
yeah, I did voice some comments about Romney. So
Yeah. Well,
So
what about it? What's your opinion?
well, I thought that Romney acted with principle, assuming that underneath all the layers of his brain that it was in fact not still actually political. Maybe he would gain from this somehow. I don't know. I'm not psychoanalyzing him.
What the Senate did, they refused to look at other
Yeah,
data.
yeah. So
Isn't that illegal?
it's illegal. It's hard to say this is. Oh, sorry.
Please repeat. If you're going to let
Oh,
people
okay.
talk from the audience, you have to repeat what
Oh,
you said.
okay. So is what the people who voted no, did they act illegally? It's hard to say that they acted illegally. Let me give a follow-up. Romney, as I understand it, the Utah legislature attempted, I'm not sure if they successfully did so, attempted to pass a censure motion against Romney, right?
Yeah.
Based on what, I have no idea.
Ridiculous.
But that is wrong too, right? So in other words, we shouldn't somehow say that a vote in the House or the Senate should be illegal unless you in fact took a bribe. I mean, that's illegal, right? But just to say that you have a difference of opinion, I wouldn't categorize it as illegal. Yes?
Very good. sort of a comment and kind of a question. The comment is that basically, I think the Congress, the House, and the Congress has the power to impeach the president for whatever it wants, and the House has, or excuse me, vice versa. The House has the ability to impeach the
No, it has
president.
to be high crimes and misdemeanors. It still has to do that.
Yes, but it's ill-defined.
Yes, it is.
Okay,
Right.
and the House has, excuse me, and the Senate has the power to remove him from office.
Right.
And to argue that this sounds very simple is true, but at the same time it's also very difficult because these are elected officials, and that it is going to be a political decision on their part. There's no way around that.
There's no way around it. That's true.
Yeah.
We don't have a perfect, way of doing this.
The other thing is, I had a kind of a question. My understanding is that members of Congress do have a certain amount of diplomatic immunity that is, as a representative, they can't be prevented from going to Washington and performing their job.
Okay.
I think they traditionally flout speeding tickets.
Okay.
Thank you. I was wondering for the longest time why the president never had to release his tax returns. And listening to your speech, I realized that it probably would be useless to do that, because even if we would find that there are some inconsistencies, which likely they are, there is almost no point of doing that at this point, because nothing will be done. You cannot really get him on that. It's a separate issue, right?
Yeah. Well, I would say it's a good thing that, as far as impeachment purposes, that doing something wrong in the tax return is not going to impeach you. I mean, it's a very complex code, and I would hate it if, some error in the tax return actually, sure, if you openly defraud, yeah, whatever the code is, it's going to put you in jail. But yeah, I myself would say, wow, I have to look at the tax returns, but I wouldn't say there's certain irregularities. It never was anyway intended to impeach him for the tax returns. It's just to, hey, you're the president. What are you hiding? This is something that's very relevant to the voters. So for that reason, yes, I think we should have the.
Usually to the elected, you actually.
I'll repeat it.
Have disclosed in the past. All of them has disclosed.
Yeah, that's so yes, there is a tradition
Right.
of disclosing your tax return. That's a fairly recent tradition, by the way. It has not been, since the beginning. The IRS didn't exist until the early 1900s.
Okay, this is going to be the last question, so no
Okay.
sense in raising your hand.
Okay.
Hi. I got a question, I guess. You honestly think that the House acted out of conviction and you hadn't heard or considered that their real goal was to try and run down the popularity of the president for the election?
Oh, I absolutely think that there's some of that motivation, yeah. I think I said that there was one articulation of the intent that probably exists, but whatever hundreds of members of the House, I'm sure each of them had their own particular reasons.